On Christmas Eve my husband the CEO demanded, say sorry to his new girlfriend or lose my paycheck and promotion. I said one word. By morning my bags were packed and my London transfer was done. My husband's father turned white. Please say you didn't send those papers. My husband's smile disappeared instantly. Send what papers? Apologize to Victoria. Tonight. At the Christmas party. In front of everyone. I stared at my husband across the mahogany desk in our home office, the personnel action form with my name on it sitting between us like a declaration of war. Robert's voice was flat, emotionless. The same tone he used when firing executives who'd outlived their usefulness. And if I don't? I asked, already knowing the answer. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here and sharing these stories of strength and self-worth. If you believe that no one should weaponize their power against those who help them succeed, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how Linda handles this betrayal. Then your salary is suspended. Your promotion is cancelled. And there are documented concerns about your behavior that could lead to termination. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't my husband. It was a CEO executing a difficult decision. This doesn't have to be complicated, Linda. Apologize to her and we move forward. Apologize to her. To Victoria Ashford. The 28-year-old Chief Innovation Officer who was sleeping with my husband. The woman whose flawed proposal I'd professionally dismantled at yesterday's board meeting because it would have destroyed everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals stood for. The woman Robert was now protecting at the cost of our 8-year marriage and my career. I looked down at the form again. Salary suspension effective immediately. Postponement of my vice president promotion. The one that was supposed to be announced January 1st. Mandatory public apology for unprofessional conduct towards senior leadership. Something crystallized in that moment. Not heartbreak. I'd already cried those tears 4 months ago when I'd come home early and heard her voice in our bedroom. This was something colder. Clearer. The kind of clarity that only comes when you realize the person you loved has become someone you don't even recognize. Okay, I said quietly. Robert blinked, visibly surprised. He'd been prepared for tears, anger, negotiation. My calm acceptance threw him completely off balance. You'll apologize? He pressed, needing confirmation. I'll handle it, I said, standing up. Not a lie. Not an agreement. Just a promise that I absolutely intended to keep. But I need to explain how we got here. How a marriage that started with so much promise could end with my husband weaponizing corporate policy against me on Christmas Eve. How the woman who'd helped build Morrison Pharmaceuticals into a successful company could be sitting in her own home being threatened with professional destruction by the man she'd once loved. It started 12 years ago, though I didn't recognize the warning signs then. I met Robert in graduate school when I was 26, deep into my PhD in biochemistry. I was spending 16-hour days in labs that smelled like formaldehyde and desperation, running experiments that failed more often than they succeeded, sustained by coffee and the stubborn belief that my research mattered. Robert was finishing his MBA, charismatic, ambitious, full of grand visions about the future. He'd walk into the graduate student lounge where I'd be reviewing research papers, and he'd sit down beside me uninvited, asking questions about my work. Not the polite, glazed-over questions most business students asked when they were trying to seem interested. Real questions. Thoughtful ones. He wanted to understand the science, wanted to know how drug development actually worked beyond the financial models and market analyses. My father runs a pharmaceutical company, he told me during one of those conversations. Small operation. Focuses on rare diseases, pediatric cancers, genetic disorders, conditions that affect thousands of people instead of millions. It's noble work, but it's bleeding money. The big pharmaceutical companies won't touch these diseases because there's no profit in it. Dr. James Morrison had founded Morrison Pharmaceuticals 30 years earlier with a mission that was almost quaint in its idealism. He believed pharmaceutical companies had a moral obligation to develop treatments for patients who were ignored by market forces, who suffered from conditions too rare to justify the massive research and development costs. It was beautiful in theory. In practice, it meant the company existed in a state of perpetual near bankruptcy, sustained more by Dr. Morrison's stubborn refusal to quit than by any rational business model. I want to change that, Robert had said, his eyes bright with conviction. I want to prove you can do well by doing good. that you can save lives and make money, that ethics and profit don't have to be mutually exclusive. I'd believed him. God, I'd believed every word. We got married 8 years ago, right after Robert took over as CEO from his father. Dr. Morrison had stepped back to chairman of the board, ready to let his son take the company in new directions while he maintained oversight. Robert had asked me to join the company as director of strategic planning, using my scientific background to evaluate drug candidates, build partnerships with research institutions, develop frameworks for sustainable growth. We'll do this together, he'd promised on our wedding night. Your science and my business sense. We'll build something extraordinary. And for a while we did. I threw myself into Morrison Pharmaceuticals with the same intensity I'd brought to my doctoral research. I built the strategic planning framework from scratch, systems for evaluating which rare disease research projects had the best chance of success, which academic partnerships were worth cultivating, how to balance ethical mission with financial sustainability. Within 4 years we'd tripled revenue. We'd secured partnerships with major research hospitals. We'd brought 2 new treatments to market. One for a rare form of pediatric leukemia, another for a genetic blood disorder. These weren't blockbuster drugs that would make us billions, but they were saving children's lives. They were exactly what Morrison Pharmaceuticals had been founded to do. Dr. Morrison loved me for that. He'd introduce me at company events as the smartest person in this organization, and I'm including myself in that assessment. He trusted my judgment on research priorities, valued my opinion on strategic decisions, made me feel like I belonged in ways that had nothing to do with being Robert's wife. Those were good years. We were building something meaningful. Robert and I would work late together, reviewing proposals at the kitchen table, debating priorities, finishing each other's sentences. We felt like partners in every sense of the word. Then success changed things. The Forbes profile came first. 30 under 30 in healthcare. Robert Morrison transforms his father's legacy company. Then the Wall Street Journal feature about young CEOs disrupting pharmaceutical industry conventions. Then the speaking invitations, the board positions at other companies, the attention from venture capitalists who saw Morrison Pharmaceuticals as an acquisition target. Robert started measuring worth by stock price instead of lives saved. He began having lunch with investors who cared only about returns, who asked questions like, "Why are you wasting resources on diseases that affect so few patients?" He'd come home from these meetings energized in ways that made me uncomfortable, talking about optimizing our portfolio and pivoting to higher margin opportunities. "We could be so much bigger," he'd say. "We're limiting ourselves by staying focused on rare diseases. There's a whole market for age management treatments, cosmetic applications of existing compounds. The profit margins are incredible." I'd remind him why his father had started this company, why we'd both chosen this work. The children who were alive because of treatments we'd developed. "I'm not saying we abandon them," Robert would respond, frustration creeping into his voice. "I'm saying we diversify. We use profitable products to fund the noble work. It's just smart business." But I'd seen this story before in the pharmaceutical industry. Companies that started with ethical missions, that promised to use profits from one area to fund research in another. Never worked that way. The profitable products always consumed more resources, demanded more attention, became the primary focus until the original mission was just marketing language on a website nobody read. I became inconvenient. The wife who reminded him of humble beginnings. The scientist who prioritized research integrity over quarterly profits. The voice asking uncomfortable questions about whether we were betraying the mission we'd started with. 6 months ago things shifted in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Robert started coming home after midnight, smelling like expensive perfume I didn't own. He'd take phone calls in other rooms, his voice dropping to intimate whispers when I walked past. He stopped touching me casually. No more hand on my shoulder when we passed in the hallway, no more kiss on the forehead when I was working late. He stopped asking about my day. Stopped listening when I talked. Stopped seeing me as anything except an obstacle to whatever future he'd convinced himself he was building. I told myself I was being paranoid. That the stress of leadership was affecting him. That successful marriages required understanding and patience. That once we got past this growth phase, things would return to how they'd been. I was lying to myself, but confronting the truth felt impossible. Then came the day 4 months ago that shattered every comfortable delusion I'd been clinging to. I'd been at a conference in Boston, 3 days of presentations about breakthrough cancer treatments, networking with researchers whose work could potentially partner with ours. My mind was spinning with possibilities when I decided to come home a day early to surprise Robert. I even stopped at the grocery store buying ingredients for pasta carbonara, the dish I'd perfected during our first year of marriage when we were still people who cooked together, who laughed over kitchen disasters, who had time for each other. I walked into our penthouse carrying groceries and hope, both of which I dropped in the entryway when I heard sounds from our bedroom. Not ambiguous sounds that I could rationalize or reinterpret. Specific sounds. Victoria's voice sang Robert's name in a way that left zero room for misinterpretation. I stood frozen, my mind cataloging details with scientific precision. Her shoes by the door, red-soled Louboutins I recognized from the office. 2 champagne glasses on our coffee table, lipstick stain on one in a shade I'd never wear. Robert's jacket draped over a chair. I backed out quietly, left the groceries in the hallway. Drove to a hotel where I spent 3 hours crying in a bathroom that smelled like industrial cleaning products. Then I dried my face, looked at myself in the mirror and made a decision. In pharmaceutical research, when a compound shows toxicity in trials, you don't spend years trying to reformulate something fundamentally flawed. You terminate the trial and start over. My marriage was showing toxicity. It was time to terminate and start over. But I didn't confront Robert. I didn't demand explanations or apologies or couples counseling that we both knew wouldn't change anything. Instead, I started planning. The next morning, I called Dr. Morrison and asked about the European expansion he'd mentioned months earlier. The idea of opening a London office to build partnerships with Cambridge and Oxford researchers. Robert doesn't understand the science like you do, Dr. Morrison had said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like disappointment. He's becoming too focused on financials. I need someone in London who remembers why we started this company. I volunteered immediately. For 4 months, I'd been working evenings and weekends building those London relationships. Vetting researchers. Evaluating compounds. Demonstrating my value to an operation 3,000 miles away. And I'd been documenting everything else. Victoria's flawed proposals. Robert's ethical compromises. Company credit card statements showing hotel rooms and jewelry purchases that had nothing to do with business. Not for revenge. For protection. For the inevitable moment when Robert would try to destroy me professionally to protect his affair. Which brought me to yesterday's board meeting where everything finally came to a head. Victoria had presented her grand restructuring proposal. Redirecting 60% of our research budget away from rare disease treatments toward cosmetic anti-aging products. It was filled with buzzwords about high-margin opportunities, and graphs that looked impressive until you examined the underlying assumptions. The science was shallow. The ethics were non-existent. It was everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals had been founded to oppose. I'd spent 3 days preparing a counter-analysis that methodically dismantled every assumption in Victoria's proposal. I'd documented why it would destroy our reputation, alienate research partners, betray our mission. Dr. Morrison had listened to both presentations, then removed his reading glasses with deliberate precision. Linda's analysis is sound. Victoria's proposal has merit for a different kind of company, but it's not who we are. Motion to table indefinitely. The board had agreed unanimously. Victoria's face had gone white, then red. She'd looked at Robert, waiting for him to defend her. He'd said nothing during the meeting. But that night he'd been ice. You humiliated her, he'd said. In front of my father. In front of the board. Which is how I ended up here. Christmas Eve. Sitting across from my husband while he demanded I apologize to his mistress or lose everything I'd built. Okay, I'd said. And I meant it. I would handle this. Just not the way Robert expected. Because in my briefcase, locked in my car downstairs, was a folder Dr. Morrison had given me an hour ago. Documents restructuring my role into Managing Director of Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe. Approved by the board. Filed with the SC. Effective January 2nd. Robert thought okay meant surrender. He was about to learn what it actually meant. I walked out of Robert's office and headed downstairs to where the Christmas party was already in full swing. The penthouse's great room had been transformed into something out of a corporate fantasy. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over marble floors. A string quartet playing something classical that nobody was actually listening to, junior executives in cocktail dresses and dark suits trying to network without appearing too desperate. I needed a drink. Or maybe I needed to leave entirely, get in my car and drive until I hit somewhere that wasn't here. But Dr. Morrison had asked me specifically to attend tonight, and after what he'd done for me, after that folder sitting in my briefcase with documents that would change everything, I owed him at least a few hours of presence. I grabbed champagne from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the windows, watching the snow fall over Manhattan while half listening to conversations about fourth-quarter earnings and holiday travel plans. My mind was still in that office upstairs, still processing the conversation that had just happened, still feeling the cold shock of watching my husband weaponize corporate policy against me. Linda. I turned to find Jennifer Chen from Regulatory Affairs standing beside me, concern written across her face. Jennifer and I had worked together for 6 years. She was brilliant, meticulous, and one of the few people in the company who seemed to operate outside the political games that consumed everyone else. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said, taking a long drink of champagne that tasted too expensive and too cold. Jennifer glanced around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. "It's about Victoria, isn't it? Robert's making you pay for yesterday's board meeting." I looked at her sharply. "How did you?" "Everyone knows," Jennifer interrupted gently. "About Robert and Victoria. About the board meeting. About the fact that you absolutely demolished her proposal with data she couldn't argue against." She paused. "People are taking sides, Linda. And you might be surprised to learn that most of the actual scientists are on yours. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It mattered more than I wanted to admit. Robert wants me to apologize to her," I said quietly. "Tonight. In front of everyone. Says my salary is suspended and my promotion is cancelled until I do." Jennifer's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "He can't do that. That's abuse of authority. He's the CEO," I said. "He can do whatever he wants. Dr. Morrison would never." "Dr. Morrison doesn't know yet." I looked at Jennifer carefully, weighing how much to say, how much to trust. "But he will. Soon." Jennifer studied my face, reading something there that made her expression shift from anger to curiosity. "You have a plan." "I have options," I corrected. Before Jennifer could respond, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations quieted, people turned toward the entrance, and I knew without looking that Victoria had arrived. Victoria Ashford was beautiful in the way that stops conversations. Tall, blonde, wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She moved through the room like she owned it, which I supposed she thought she did now that she'd secured the CEO's attention. I'd watched this transformation over the past 6 months. Ever since Robert had hired her as Chief Innovation Officer without consulting me despite the obvious overlap with my strategic planning responsibilities. She'd arrived with credentials that looked perfect on paper. Stanford MBA, former consultant at Bain, a TED Talk on disruptive innovation in healthcare that had 2 million views. I'd watched that talk once, forcing myself through 18 minutes of buzzwords and inspirational platitudes that said absolutely nothing of substance if you actually understood pharmaceutical research. But Robert had been mesmerized. I remembered watching him during her interview presentation, seeing something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years when he looked at me. Fascination, desire, that particular thrill of something new and shiny and untested. "We need fresh perspectives," he told me when I'd questioned the hire privately. "New ways of thinking. You're brilliant, Linda, but sometimes you're too focused on the science and not enough on the business." Translation: you care about the mission and that's become inconvenient. I should have fought harder then. Should have insisted on being part of the decision-making process. Should have recognized that Robert was already laying groundwork for my marginalization, choosing someone whose loyalty would be to him rather than to the company's founding principles. But I'd still been trying to be the supportive wife, still believing that questioning his judgment would make me look insecure rather than professionally concerned. Victoria saw me across the room and smiled, bright and sharp and triumphant. She raised her champagne glass in a mock toast that made my stomach turn. "She thinks she's won," Jennifer murmured beside me. "She has won," I said. "At least the battle she thinks we're fighting." "What does that mean?" I drained my champagne and set the empty glass on a nearby table. "It means Victoria is playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess." 3 months after Victoria's arrival, she'd presented her grand strategic vision to the board. The restructuring proposal that had led directly to yesterday's disaster and tonight's ultimatum. I'd spent 3 days preparing my counteranalysis, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and the growing rage that came from watching someone with minimal pharmaceutical knowledge try to dismantle decades of meaningful work. Victoria's proposal had been full of graphs that looked impressive and buzzwords that meant nothing. Pivoting to high-margin opportunities. Optimizing resource allocation. Leveraging existing compounds for expanded market penetration. What it actually meant was abandoning children with rare genetic disorders in favor of selling anti-aging creams to wealthy consumers who didn't need them. The science was shallow, repurposing existing compounds for cosmetic applications, work that required minimal research but could be marketed at premium prices. The profit margins were undeniably attractive. The ethics were non-existent. I'd documented every flaw in her analysis. The false assumptions about market size. The underestimated costs of regulatory approval for cosmetic products. The complete failure to account for reputational damage when our lead researchers resigned in protest, which they would and which I'd documented with signed statements from 3 department heads. When I'd presented at the board meeting, Victoria's face had gone white, then red. Her voice had gotten sharper and more defensive with each challenge, revealing that she didn't actually understand the science she was proposing to revolutionize. Dr. Morrison had listened to both presentations with that careful attention he brought to everything. When Victoria finished, he'd removed his reading glasses and set them on the table with deliberate precision. "Linda's analysis is sound," he'd said quietly. "Victoria's proposal has merit for a different kind of company, but it's not who we are." Motion to table indefinitely. The board had agreed unanimously. I should have felt vindication. Instead, I'd felt dread watching Robert's face throughout the meeting, seeing him store every moment of Victoria's humiliation like ammunition he'd use later. Which he had. Less than 24 hours later, in fact. "Linda." I turned to find Robert standing beside me, Victoria at his side, her hand possessive on his arm. Up close she was even more striking. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, that particular polish that came from having both money and time to maintain it. "Robert," I said evenly. "Victoria. We need to talk," Robert said, his voice carrying that flat authority that meant this wasn't a request. "I thought we already did," I replied. "In your office. About 30 minutes ago." Robert's jaw tightened. "I meant all 3 of us. Victoria deserves an explanation for yesterday's." "Victoria got an explanation yesterday," I interrupted, looking directly at her. "At the board meeting, where I presented data showing why her proposal would damage the company my father-in-law spent 30 years building." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something cold entered her eyes. "It's interesting that you frame it that way. As if protecting outdated business models is the same as protecting the company's future. It's interesting that you think anti-aging creams represent the future of pharmaceutical research," I countered. "But then you've never actually worked in pharmaceutical research, have you? Just consulted on it. From the outside. For companies that prioritize profit over patients." "Linda." Robert's voice carried a warning. "What?" I looked at him. "Did you want me to apologize now? Here. Is that what this conversation is about?" Robert glanced around, noticing that we'd attracted attention, that nearby conversations had gone quiet as people sensed confrontation. "Not here," he said tightly. "Upstairs. In my office. 5 minutes." He walked away without waiting for confirmation, Victoria following, her red dress a slash of color through the neutral-toned crowd. Jennifer appeared at my elbow. "Please tell me you're not going up there alone." "I'm not alone," I said quietly. "I have everything I need." "Linda, he's going to try to force this. In front of her. He's going to make you choose between your dignity and your career." "I know," I said. "But Jennifer, he doesn't understand what choice I've already made." I touched her arm briefly, grateful for her concern, then headed toward the elevator that would take me back upstairs to Robert's office. Back to the conversation that would end my marriage and begin everything else. The folder in my briefcase felt heavier than it should, full of documents that represented 4 months of quiet preparation, of building relationships Robert knew nothing about, of creating options he didn't know existed. Okay, I'd told him earlier. And I'd meant it. But not in any way he understood. The elevator doors closed and I watched the party disappear below me. All those people celebrating a holiday in a company that was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. When the doors opened on the executive floor, I could see lights spilling from Robert's office down the hall. I squared my shoulders and walked toward it. Toward the confrontation that had been coming since the day I'd heard Victoria's voice in my bedroom 4 months ago. Toward the moment when OK would transform from apparent surrender into something Robert would spend months trying to understand. Robert's office was exactly as I'd left it 30 minutes earlier. Mahogany desk positioned to dominate the room, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that had probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, everything arranged to project power and control. Victoria was already there, standing near the windows with her champagne glass, looking like she belonged in this space more than I ever had. Robert sat behind his desk in what I'd come to think of as his throne, the leather chair that had been custom-made to his specifications, designed to make him sit slightly higher than anyone across from him. Small psychological games. CEO tricks I'd watched him learn from business books and executive coaching sessions. "Close the door," Robert said when I entered. I closed it, the click echoing louder than it should have in the sudden silence. "Sit," he added, gesturing to one of the chairs facing his desk. I remained standing. A small rebellion, perhaps meaningless, but I'd learned over the past months that sometimes the only power you have left is refusing to make yourself comfortable in your own humiliation. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. He noticed. Of course he noticed. It was one of the things that had made him successful. That attention to detail, that ability to read people and situations and adjust his approach accordingly. "We need to resolve this situation," he said, his voice dropping into that flat, professional tone that made everything sound like a business transaction. "Victoria has expressed concerns about working with you going forward, and frankly, after yesterday's board meeting, I share those concerns." "Concerns," I repeated, the word feeling strange in my mouth. "About me doing my job. About presenting accurate data that contradicted a flawed proposal." Victoria set her champagne glass down with deliberate precision. "Your presentation wasn't about data, Linda. It was about making me look incompetent in front of the board. About undermining my credibility because you see me as a threat." I almost laughed. Almost. Because the sheer audacity of it, her standing in my husband's office, wearing a dress that probably cost more than our researchers earned in a month, accusing me of feeling threatened by her, was so absurd it almost broke through the cold anger that had been building in my chest. "I see you as exactly what you are," I said quietly. "A consultant with an MBA who thinks buzzwords and TED Talks qualify you to revolutionize pharmaceutical research. Someone who's never spent a day in a lab, never evaluated a clinical trial, never had to tell parents that we don't have a treatment for their child's disease because it's not profitable enough for the big companies to bother with. Linda." Robert's voice carried a warning, but I ignored him. "Your proposal would have gutted our rare disease research division. It would have driven away every serious researcher we have. It would have destroyed everything Morrison Pharmaceuticals was founded to do. And yes, I presented data showing exactly that. Because that's my job. Or it was, until apparently doing my job became grounds for disciplinary action." Victoria's face had gone red, her composure cracking. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This hostility. This refusal to consider alternative viewpoints. Robert, you see what I mean, don't you?" Robert stood up, walked around his desk to stand beside Victoria. The gesture was deliberate, choosing his position, making clear whose side he was on. "Linda, you need to understand something," he said. "Victoria is a senior leader in this organization. She reports directly to me. When you undermine her publicly, you undermine my authority and my decision-making. That's not acceptable." "What's not acceptable?" I said, my voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. "Is using your position as CEO to protect your personal relationship at the expense of the company's mission and your wife's career." The words hung in the air like smoke. Robert's face went pale, then flushed. "What are you implying?" he asked, though we all knew exactly what I was implying. "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm stating facts. You hired Victoria without consulting me despite obvious overlap with my responsibilities. You've supported her proposals over the objections of experienced researchers. You're now using HR mechanisms to punish me for presenting data that contradicted her strategy. Either your judgment has been catastrophically compromised, or you're deliberately sabotaging me. Neither option reflects well on your leadership. Victoria made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. This is incredible. Robert, she's actually accusing you of professional misconduct because she can't accept that her approach is outdated and her attitude is toxic. My approach saved the company from a strategic disaster, I shot back. Your approach would have turned us into just another cosmetics company chasing profit margins while children with rare diseases continue to suffer because no one will develop treatments for them. Enough. Robert's voice cut through the argument with CEO authority. This is exactly the problem, Linda. This inability to collaborate. This need to be right at everyone else's expense. This is why we're here. He walked back to his desk, opened a drawer and pulled out the personnel action form I'd seen earlier. He laid it on the desk between us like evidence at a trial. This is effective immediately, he said, and his voice had gone completely flat now, emotionless in that way that meant he'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. Your salary is suspended pending resolution of documented concerns about your professional conduct. Your promotion to vice president is postponed indefinitely. And you're required to issue a public apology to Victoria acknowledging that your approach at yesterday's board meeting was inappropriate. I stared at the form, reading the words again even though I'd already seen them. Unprofessional conduct towards senior leadership. Failure to demonstrate collaborative approach. Concerns regarding judgment and team dynamics. Corporate language designed to sound objective while meaning whatever the person wielding it wanted it to mean. This is retaliation, I said quietly. Using company policy to punish me for challenging Victoria's proposal. Using your authority as CEO to protect your, I paused, choosing my words carefully, professional relationship with her. This is accountability, Robert countered. For behavior that multiple people have documented as problematic. Multiple people, I repeated. You mean Victoria? Who documented concerns after I contradicted her at a board meeting. That's not multiple people. That's one person with a vested interest in discrediting me. There are other complaints, Robert said. From researchers who felt bullied by your management style. From colleagues who've experienced your dismissive attitude toward ideas that don't align with your vision. This was news to me. Researchers complaining about me. I'd spent 8 years building relationships with our research teams, defending their work, fighting for resources they needed. The idea that they'd complained about me felt like fiction. Unless Robert was simply making it up. Creating a paper trail to justify what he was about to do. Show me the documentation, I said. These complaints from researchers. I want to see them. That's part of the HR investigation, Robert said. You'll have access to relevant materials through the proper channels. In other words, you can't show me because they don't exist. In other words, there are proper procedures that we're following. Robert's voice was getting harder now, frustrated that I wasn't simply accepting this. Linda, I'm trying to handle this professionally. I'm giving you a chance to resolve this without it escalating further. All you need to do is acknowledge that your approach was inappropriate and commit to better collaboration going forward. Better collaboration, I said. Meaning I should support Victoria's proposals even when they're fundamentally flawed. Meaning I should stay quiet when I see strategic mistakes being made. Meaning I should prioritize protecting egos over protecting the company's mission. Meaning you should treat senior leadership with respect. Victoria interjected. Meaning you should find ways to express concerns that don't involve humiliating people in front of the board. Meaning you should recognize that you're not the only person in this company with valuable insights. I looked at her, really looked at her, trying to understand what she actually wanted. Was this about professional ambition? About securing her position by eliminating someone she saw as competition? Or was it something more personal? Proving to herself, to Robert, to everyone that she'd won, that she'd successfully replaced me in every aspect of his life? Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe people's motivations were never as simple as we wanted them to be. I'm not apologizing, I said, turning back to Robert. Not to her, not to you, not to anyone. I presented accurate data at a board meeting using appropriate professional channels. If Victoria is embarrassed by having her proposal rejected, that's a consequence of submitting a flawed proposal, not of me being unprofessional. Robert's jaw tightened. Then the suspension stands. And if you continue to refuse, we'll have to consider whether your position here is viable at all. Are you threatening to fire me? I asked, my voice still calm despite everything. On Christmas Eve? While we're hosting a party downstairs. I'm explaining consequences, Robert said. Actions have consequences, Linda. You can't undermine leadership and expect no response. I thought about the folder in my briefcase downstairs. About Dr. Morrison's documents restructuring my role, transforming me from Robert's subordinate into someone who reported directly to the board. About 4 months of quietly building relationships in London, demonstrating my value to an operation Robert knew nothing about. About the choice I'd already made before I'd even walked into this office. You're right, I said. Actions do have consequences. You're about to learn that. Robert frowned, uncertain again, that crack in his confidence widening slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not the person you seem to think I am, I said. The person who'll accept humiliation to keep a job. The person who'll apologize for being right because it makes you uncomfortable. The person who'll stay in a company where the CEO uses his authority to protect his affair at his wife's expense. You need to be very careful about what you're implying, Robert said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. I'm not implying anything, I said again. I'm simply stating that I won't be apologizing to Victoria. I won't be accepting this suspension. And I won't be staying in a position where my professional judgment is weaponized against me because it conflicts with your personal interests. Victoria laughed, sharp and brittle. So what, you're just going to quit? Walk away from everything you've built here? Because that's what happens when you refuse to be a team player, Linda. You isolate yourself. You end up with nothing. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I end up with something better. Something that doesn't require compromising my integrity or watching the mission I believed in get dismantled for profit margins and ego. I turned toward the door, done with this conversation, done with trying to make them understand something they had no interest in understanding. Linda. Robert's voice stopped me at the threshold. If you walk out of here without agreeing to these terms, there's no coming back. This is your last chance to handle this the easy way. I looked back at him, at this man I'd married 12 years ago when I still believed love and ambition could coexist without destroying each other. Hey, I said. The same word I'd said earlier. The word he'd taken as surrender. But this time I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he'd miscalculated something fundamental. I'll handle this, I added. Tonight. At the party. You'll get your answer. Then I walked out, leaving them standing in that office, probably already congratulating themselves on winning a battle they didn't understand they'd just lost. The war was over before they even knew it had started. I walked out of Robert's office for the second time that night and took the elevator back down to the party. My hands were steady as I pressed the button, my breathing calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The elevator descended smoothly, each floor taking me further from the confrontation upstairs and closer to the moment that would change everything. When the doors opened, the party was still in full swing. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ playing something with a careful balance between festive and professional. Junior analysts were dancing now, emboldened by champagne and the temporary suspension of workplace hierarchies that company parties created. I found Dr. Morrison near the windows where I'd left him earlier, watching the snow fall over Manhattan with the particular stillness of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize pivotal moments when they arrived. It's done, I said quietly, standing beside him. He didn't ask what I meant. He'd known this was coming from the moment he'd handed me that folder. You're sure about London? He asked instead. Once you make this announcement, there's no walking it back. Robert will. He paused, choosing his words carefully. My son will not handle this well. I know, I said. But staying would destroy me. Slowly, methodically, one small humiliation at a time until I couldn't remember who I was before I became someone who accepted being treated like this. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly, something like pride crossing his weathered face. Your flight is Monday morning? 6 a.m. out of JFK. I land at Heathrow Tuesday evening, London time. The apartment in Shoreditch should be ready by Wednesday. The team is excited, Dr. Morrison said. Marcus has already started reaching out to his Cambridge contacts. Elena has set up introductions with 3 Oxford research groups for your first week. David has the budget projections ready for review. I'd been working with that London team for 4 months through video calls and email exchanges, building relationships while my marriage disintegrated and Robert grew increasingly hostile. They felt more like colleagues than anyone in the New York office had in years. People who valued competence over politics, who cared about the work itself rather than using it as a stepping stone to somewhere else. "Thank you," I said to Dr. Morrison, meaning it for so much more than just the job. For seeing what Robert was becoming. For giving me a way out that isn't just running away. "You earned this," he said firmly. "The London position isn't a favor or a rescue mission. It's recognition that you're the best person to build what we need in Europe. Robert will eventually understand that. Or he won't. But either way, it won't change the fact that you've earned this opportunity through merit." The music shifted to something slower, more contemplative. I watched executives drift toward the bar for refills, saw Victoria emerge from the elevator and scan the room until her eyes found Robert, who'd appeared moments after her. Their faces were tight, uncertain. Whatever confidence they'd felt upstairs had been replaced by something else. Concern, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that the situation wasn't as controlled as they'd thought. Robert's eyes found mine across the room. For a moment we just looked at each other. Husband and wife, CEO and Director of Strategic Planning, two people who'd once believed they were building something together and had somehow ended up as adversaries in a corporate drama neither of us had wanted. Then he started walking toward me, Victoria close behind, and I knew the time had come. Dr. Morrison touched my arm briefly. "Good luck, Linda. Though I don't think you'll need it." I waited until Robert was close enough that I wouldn't have to shout, but far enough that other people would hear what I was about to say. The conversations around us quieted as people sensed something significant was happening. "I have something to say," I announced, my voice carrying across the great room with more steadiness than I felt. The music stopped. The DJ, reading the room with professional instinct, killed the track mid-beat. In the sudden silence, every person at Morrison Pharmaceuticals' Christmas party turned to look at me. Robert's face showed satisfaction. He thought he'd won, thought I'd bent to his ultimatum, thought I was about to publicly apologize to Victoria and cement his control over both his company and his personal life. Victoria's smile was radiant, triumphant. She raised her champagne glass in a small gesture that looked celebratory to anyone watching but that I knew was mocking. A private acknowledgement that she'd taken everything that had been mine and I was about to acknowledge her victory publicly. I looked at both of them, these people who'd thought they could corner me, force my compliance, make me choose between dignity and survival. "I'm resigning from my position as Director of Strategic Planning," I said clearly, watching Robert's satisfaction drain into confusion. "Effective immediately. I've accepted the role of Managing Director for Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe. I'll be relocating to London next week to oversee our expansion there." The silence deepened, changed quality. Confusion rippled through the room. People exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Robert's face went white, then red. "You can't. That position doesn't exist. I haven't authorized any." "The board authorized it 2 weeks ago," I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Dr. Morrison signed off personally. It's already been filed with the SEC. I'm surprised you didn't see the paperwork, Robert. But then you've been quite distracted lately." That last part was petty, perhaps, but I allowed myself the small satisfaction of watching him realize that everyone in this room now understood exactly what I was implying. Dr. Morrison stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the windows. "Robert, perhaps we should discuss this in private." "No." Robert's voice was sharp, almost desperate. "Linda, you can't just leave. We have projects there are responsibilities. That need someone who understands the science," I finished for him. "Someone who cares about the mission. I'll be doing exactly that work in London. Everything's already arranged. Housing, visa, team structure. I start January 2nd. I turned to Victoria, gave her the coldest smile I could manage. "Congratulations on your promotion to Director of Strategic Planning. I'm sure you'll do wonderfully. I've left detailed transition notes in my office. You'll need them." Victoria's face had gone pale. She'd expected humiliation, mine, not hers. She'd expected validation, public acknowledgement that she'd won, that she'd successfully replaced me in every aspect of Robert's life. Instead, she was being handed a job she wasn't qualified for, in front of everyone who knew she wasn't qualified for it, as the woman she'd tried to destroy walked away with dignity intact. I started toward the exit, my head high, my heart pounding but my expression serene. Linda, wait, Robert's voice cracked slightly. We need to talk about this. You can't just. I paused at the door, looked back at the room full of executives watching this corporate drama unfold. My eyes found Dr. Morrison, who gave me the slightest nod of approval. Okay, I said, using the same word I'd given Robert twice already tonight. The word he'd taken as surrender. In this context, in front of all these witnesses, it meant something entirely different. It meant, okay, I'm done. Okay, I choose myself. Okay, you're about to discover what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. Then I walked out into the December night, into the snow that was falling harder now, into the first moments of my new life. Behind me, I heard Robert's voice, loud with panic. Dad, please tell me she didn't file the succession documents. Please tell me you didn't sign off on equity restructuring without consulting me. Dr. Morrison's response was quiet but carried in the sudden silence. I consulted with the board, Robert. That's all the consultation required. Perhaps you should have paid more attention to what your wife was building instead of a deliberate pause, other concerns. I didn't stay to hear the rest. I had 36 hours until my flight to London, a hotel room near JFK waiting for me, and the beginning of a future that was finally entirely mine. The snow was cold against my face as I walked to where I'd parked my car. My phone was already buzzing with texts and calls, but I ignored them all. There would be time for logistics and explanations and the administrative dismantling of a marriage. But tonight I just needed to feel this. The weight lifting from my chest, the possibility opening before me, the understanding that I'd chosen myself over everything else and the sky hadn't fallen. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd won, though not in any way Robert or Victoria would understand. I'd won by refusing to play their game. By building something they didn't know existed until it was too late to stop it. By saying okay and meaning something completely different from what they'd heard. I got in my car and drove toward JFK, toward the hotel room where I'd spend Christmas morning, toward London and a team who didn't know about affairs or betrayals or marriages ending in penthouse offices. Toward a life where I could just be Linda again. Where my work would be judged on merit rather than politics. Where I wouldn't have to fight for space in my own marriage or dignity in my own company. The Manhattan skyline receded in my rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by snow and distance. And I felt nothing but relief. The hotel room near JFK was exactly what you'd expect from corporate lodging: beige walls, generic landscape prints, a bed that was comfortable enough but forgettable. I checked in just after midnight on Christmas Eve, still wearing the emerald silk dress from the party, my suitcases already packed and waiting in the car. I should have felt something dramatic. Grief, maybe, or rage, or the kind of cathartic relief that comes from finally escaping something toxic. Instead, I just felt tired and oddly empty, like I'd been holding my breath for months and had finally exhaled but didn't quite know what to do with the space that created. My phone had been buzzing constantly since I'd left the party. I'd turned off the sound, but the screen kept lighting up with notifications. Texts, calls, voicemails accumulating like evidence of the chaos I'd left behind. 23 calls from Robert. 18 from Victoria. 6 from various executives. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I ordered room service, a club sandwich I barely touched, and spent Christmas Eve reviewing documents for London, trying to focus on the future rather than the wreckage of the past. Christmas morning, I woke early and called Dr. Morrison. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Linda, how are you holding up? I'm fine, I said, which wasn't quite true but wasn't quite a lie either. How bad was it after I left? Dr. Morrison sighed and I heard coffee being poured, that small domestic sound somehow grounding across the phone line. Robert spent most of the night trying to find legal grounds to block your transfer. He called 3 different lawyers, woke up the board's general counsel at 1 a.m. They all told him the same thing. Your contract has international mobility clauses, the London position is a legitimate promotion, the board approval is ironclad. There's nothing he can do. And Victoria? Furious that you're taking research relationships with you. She apparently tried to demand that you turn over your contact lists, your Cambridge and Oxford connections, as if professional relationships built over a decade are company property that can be transferred like office furniture. I laughed darkly at that. Victoria really had no idea how any of this worked. You couldn't just inherit credibility or trust or the kind of professional relationships that made research partnerships possible. What did you tell her? That Linda Morrison's professional relationships belong to Linda Morrison, and if she chooses to leverage them for Morrison Pharmaceuticals Europe, that's exactly what we'd hope she'd do. He paused. Robert asked me to reconsider the London position. Said having you operating independently would create conflicts with his strategic vision for the company. What did you say? I said that perhaps it's time the company had more than one strategic vision. That relying entirely on one person's judgment, especially when that judgment has been questionable lately, isn't sound governance. Another pause, heavier this time. He hung up on me, Linda. First time he's ever done that. We talked logistics after that. My flight Monday morning, the apartment in Shoreditch that would be ready by Wednesday, the team that was already preparing for my arrival. Before hanging up, Dr. Morrison said something that made my chest tighten. I'm sorry. For what he did to you. For what he became. You deserved better from my son and from this family. I sat with that apology for a long time after the call ended, staring out at the New York skyline through the hotel window, gray and cold in December morning light. I spent the rest of Christmas Day in that room, not celebrating but preparing. I reviewed housing contracts, studied UK employment regulations, mapped out my first 90 days in London with the same methodical precision I'd brought to pharmaceutical research. My phone buzzed periodically with text from Robert. First angry, then pleading, then angry again. I didn't read them. I'd blocked his number after typing out a single response. My lawyer will contact you about separation proceedings. Please have all future communication go through legal counsel. Monday morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. I checked out of the hotel at 4 a.m., returned my rental car, went through security with my British work visa and my carefully organized documents proving that yes, I had legitimate employment waiting in London. No, I wasn't planning to overstay. The flight was long and gave me too much time to think. I'd brought work, research proposals to review, partnership agreements to study, but found myself staring out the window instead, watching the Atlantic scroll past below, that vast gray expanse separating my old life from whatever came next. I landed at Heathrow Tuesday evening, exhausted and disoriented by jet lag and the sheer magnitude of what I'd just done. But Marcus met me at arrivals with a sign that said, Dr. Morrison, and a genuinely warm smile, and something in my chest loosened slightly. Welcome to London, he said, helping with my luggage. The team is very excited to work with you. We've got your apartment ready, groceries stocked, even found a decent coffee maker since Elena mentioned Americans are particular about their coffee. That small kindness, the thoughtfulness of stocking groceries, of thinking about coffee preferences, made me feel more welcome than I'd felt in New York in years. The Shoreditch office was everything Dr. Morrison had promised. Modern but not ostentatious, filled with natural light, the kind of space where you could actually think rather than just perform productivity for whoever might be watching. My team was small, 8 people initially, but they were genuinely excited about the work we'd be doing. Not excited about climbing corporate ladders or positioning themselves for promotions, but excited about the actual science, the actual mission of developing treatments for diseases nobody else would touch. No one here knows, I realized during that first week. About the affair. About the Christmas Eve confrontation. About personnel action forms and ultimatums and marriages ending in penthouse offices. They just knew me as Dr. Linda Morrison, the new managing director with a reputation for identifying promising research partnerships and building sustainable operations. It was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. But New York didn't disappear just because I'd flown across an ocean. News filtered back through professional networks and former colleagues who stayed in touch despite the awkwardness of my departure. Jennifer from Regulatory Affairs started sending emails, carefully worded updates that felt like intelligence reports from behind enemy lines. Thought you should know, they always began before detailing the latest disaster. Victoria's Cosmetics pivot had been approved by Robert over objections from senior researchers. Within 2 months, 3 of our best scientists had resigned in protest. Dr. Sarah Chin, who'd been developing a promising treatment for pediatric leukemia, had left for Johns Hopkins, taking her entire research team with her. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, our lead researcher on rare genetic disorders, had accepted a position at Boston Children's Hospital, explicitly citing the company's abandonment of its founding mission. Each departure created ripples. Other researchers grew nervous, started updating their CVs, taking calls from recruiters. Morale collapsed. Productivity suffered. The culture here is toxic now, Jennifer wrote in March. People don't trust leadership. Robert keeps promising that the cosmetics division will generate revenue to fund rare disease research, but nobody believes him. It's the same lie pharmaceutical companies always tell: we'll do the profitable work to subsidize the mission work, and it never actually works that way. I read these updates with complicated feelings. Vindication that I'd been right about Victoria's proposal, but also sadness watching something I'd helped build crumble from leadership failures I'd predicted but couldn't prevent. Mark from research operations called every few weeks, ostensibly with technical questions about projects I'd initiated but really just checking on me, making sure London was working out. You should see the Fortune profile they did on Robert, he said during one call in late spring. It's incredible. Glowing praise for his bold strategic vision and willingness to make tough decisions. They make him sound like he's revolutionizing healthcare. I found the article later that day. Couldn't help myself despite knowing it would just make me angry. The profile was exactly what Mark had described. Robert photographed in his corner office, looking confident and visionary. Victoria mentioned as his innovative chief strategy officer driving expansion into high-growth markets. My departure referenced in a single sentence about restructuring leadership and amicable transition. Amicable. That word again. As if anything about what had happened was amicable. What the Fortune journalist hadn't mentioned, what they'd either missed or deliberately ignored, was the talent hemorrhaging from Morrison Pharmaceuticals, the erosion of academic partnerships, the quiet crisis happening beneath Robert's carefully managed public image. Does he believe his own spin now? I'd asked Mark. Or is he just performing for the cameras? I honestly don't know anymore, Mark had replied. He and Victoria are inseparable. She's basically co-CEO at this point. They make every major decision together, and anyone who questions them gets marginalized or pushed out. Through Jennifer's updates, I learned that Victoria was struggling badly in her expanded role. Turned out an MBA and a TED Talk didn't actually prepare you to evaluate pharmaceutical research or build relationships with academics who'd spent decades in the field. She tried to leverage my old Cambridge and Oxford contacts, but those relationships had been built on trust and scientific credibility she simply didn't possess. Dr. Hammond at Cambridge had apparently told her, quite directly, that he had no interest in partnering with a company that prioritized anti-aging creams over life-saving treatments. Dr. Okonkwo at Oxford had been more diplomatic but equally firm. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' reputation had deteriorated significantly under new leadership. Victoria had responded by trying to buy partnerships, throwing money at institutions, offering inflated research grants, attempting to purchase credibility she couldn't earn. Some smaller programs had accepted the funding, but the top-tier researchers, the ones whose work actually mattered, had politely declined. She'd also made critical evaluation mistakes. Jennifer sent me a confidential email detailing how Victoria had approved 3 cosmetic research projects that were scientifically questionable at best. One compound had shown liver toxicity in early trials, but Victoria had pushed it forward anyway, convinced the marketing potential outweighed the risks. The FDA had killed that project before it even reached phase 1 trials. Cost to Morrison Pharmaceuticals: $8 million and significant reputational damage. Robert should have held Victoria accountable for these failures. Instead, he defended every decision, interpreted every criticism as personal attack rather than legitimate professional concern. It was the same dynamic I'd experienced. Robert's ego so entangled with Victoria that admitting her incompetence would mean admitting his own judgment had been catastrophically compromised. By July, 7 months after I'd left, the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' stock price had dropped 15%. An industry analyst published a report questioning whether the company had lost its competitive advantage in rare disease treatments, the very niche that had made them valuable. Dr. Morrison called me one evening in August, his voice carrying exhaustion that worried me deeply. "The board is getting restless," he said. 3 members have approached me privately expressing concerns about Robert's leadership. They're not ready to act yet, but they're watching carefully. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Long pause. "He's my son, Linda. I want to believe he'll recognize his mistakes and correct course." But I'm also the chairman of a company with responsibilities to employees, patients, shareholders. If he continues like this. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We talked about London after that. He wanted detailed reports on our progress, seemed to draw energy from hearing about partnerships succeeding, compounds advancing through trials. You're building what I always hoped this company could be, he said before hanging up. Robert's building what I always feared it might become. That conversation haunted me for days. Dr. Morrison was 74 now, visibly declining, watching his life's work fracture under his son's leadership. I threw myself deeper into London work, partly to justify his faith in me, partly to avoid dwelling on New York's collapse. A disaster I'd escaped but couldn't completely separate myself from. Not when it involved people I'd worked with and a mission I still believed in despite everything. The London summer was surprisingly warm that July, the kind of weather that made British people declare a heat wave, while Americans looked confused about what the fuss was over 75 degrees. I'd been in the office late working on a partnership proposal with Cambridge when my phone rang around 7 p.m. Dr. Morrison's name on the screen made my stomach tighten. He didn't usually call this late, and when he did, it meant something significant had happened. Linda. His voice sounded strained, older than I'd heard it even during our difficult conversations about Robert's declining leadership. I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. The board is launching an investigation into Robert's use of company funds. I set down my pen carefully, my mind immediately jumping to those credit card statements I'd documented months ago. The hotel rooms. The jewelry purchases. The restaurant bills that had nothing to do with legitimate business expenses. What kind of investigation? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Inappropriate expenses. Possible personal enrichment. Violations of our ethics policies. Dr. Morrison paused and I heard something that might have been a glass being set down, liquid being poured. He was drinking, which he rarely did. An anonymous report was filed with our compliance hotline 3 weeks ago. Very detailed documentation. Dates, amounts, even photographs of credit card statements. My chest tightened. Dr. Morrison, I need you to understand something. I documented those expenses, yes. I kept records as insurance in case Robert tried to come after me legally. But I never filed any reports. I never sent anything to compliance or the board or anyone else. I had to ask, he said quietly. Not because I thought you would, but because the board will ask me and I needed to be able to answer honestly. Then who? I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, the answer was crystallizing with devastating clarity. That's what I can't figure out, Dr. Morrison said. Who else would have access to this information? Who else would have documentation detailed enough to? Victoria, I interrupted. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, what? But she and Robert are together. Why would she? We're together, I corrected, my mind racing through the implications. Dr. Morrison, think about it. Victoria aligned herself with Robert when he had power and could advance her career. But what's been happening over the past 7 months? I could hear him thinking, connecting dots. The researcher departures. The failed projects. The stock price decline. Exactly. Robert's reputation has been declining steadily. The board has been questioning his judgment. And Victoria has been struggling visibly in her role. She can't build academic partnerships, she's made costly evaluation mistakes, she's basically proven that she's not qualified for the position Robert gave her. I stood up, pacing my office as the pieces fell into place. She's cutting ties before the ship sinks. And what better way than to position herself as a whistleblower? She can claim she was uncomfortable with Robert's ethics all along but felt too vulnerable to speak up until now. She distances herself from his failures, gets credit for doing the right thing, maybe even angles for his position when he's forced out. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. That's extraordinarily calculating. That's Victoria, I said. She's always been calculating. That's what made her successful as a consultant. The ability to read situations and position herself advantageously. Robert mistook that for genuine connection because he wanted to believe someone that beautiful and ambitious actually cared about him rather than what he could do for her. God, Dr. Morrison said softly. What have I let happen to my company? You didn't let anything happen, I said firmly. Robert made his choices. Victoria made hers. You're the one who created alternatives, who made sure the mission could survive regardless of what happened in New York. London is thriving because you had the foresight to build something separate from Robert's leadership. We talked for another 20 minutes about the investigation, how external counsel had been brought in, how thoroughly they were reviewing expenses, how Robert would be given a chance to explain, but the documentation was apparently damning. If the board asks for your documentation, Dr. Morrison said before hanging up, would you provide it? I thought carefully. If it's necessary to protect the company, yes. But I won't volunteer it. I don't want to be the vindictive ex-wife who brought him down. If Victoria's evidence is sufficient, let that be enough. The investigation took 3 months. I heard about it in pieces, through Dr. Morrison's periodic updates, through Jennifer's increasingly detailed emails, through the strange silence from other New York contacts who suddenly didn't know what to say to me. Jennifer's access to board-level gossip turned out to be surprisingly comprehensive. Her emails painted a picture of methodical demolition as external counsel interviewed employees, reviewed transactions, built a timeline that couldn't be explained away. They found nearly $200,000 in inappropriate expenses over 18 months, she wrote in September. Hotel suites, jewelry that never appeared on any gift disclosure forms, restaurant bills that clearly weren't business-related. And here's the part that's really damaging. Robert approved consulting contracts with a firm owned by Victoria's brother. Never disclosed the connection, never went through proper conflict of interest review. Basically used company money to funnel income to Victoria's family. I read that sitting at my desk in Shoreditch watching rain streak the windows, feeling something complicated twist in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of grim validation. I'd been right about Robert's judgment being compromised. I'd been right that his relationship with Victoria was affecting his professional decisions. I'd been right, and being right felt hollow and sad rather than triumphant. Marcus knocked on my office door around that time, concerned about my expression. Everything okay? Just news from New York, I said, closing my laptop. Nothing that affects our work here. But that wasn't entirely true. Morrison Pharmaceuticals' reputation was taking hits that affected the entire organization, including the European division. Some potential partners were asking questions about leadership stability, about whether the company's mission was changing, about whether they wanted to associate with an organization that was making headlines for the wrong reasons. The board met today, Jennifer wrote in late September. Executive session, no minutes recorded. Robert looked like he'd aged a decade. Victoria wasn't there. Apparently she's been put on leave pending investigation results. Rumor is she's negotiating her exit package behind the scenes. So Victoria was getting out ahead of it. Smart. She'd position herself as someone who'd been caught up in Robert's misconduct rather than as an active participant. She'd probably land somewhere else within months, her resume carefully scrubbed to emphasize successes while burying the disasters. That was how people like Victoria operated, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always positioning for the next opportunity, always willing to sacrifice anyone who became inconvenient to their upward trajectory. In early October, Dr. Morrison called again. The board gave him a choice. Resign quietly with basic severance, or face termination for cause and possible legal action to recover the misappropriated funds. What did he choose? I asked, though I already knew. Resignation. His lawyer advised it. Fighting would mean public trials, media coverage, everything becoming much uglier than it already is. Dr. Morrison's voice carried exhaustion that worried me. There'll be a press release tomorrow. Standard language about pursuing other opportunities. The press release arrived the next morning, forwarded by Jennifer with no comment necessary. Robert Morrison was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The company was grateful for his leadership during a period of growth and transformation. No mention of investigations or ethical violations or nearly $200,000 in inappropriate expenses. Just careful corporate language that said everything to people who knew how to read between the lines and nothing to everyone else. Victoria's not getting his job, Jennifer added in a follow-up email. Board brought in Dr. Patricia Hammond from Merck. Spent 20 years developing rare disease treatments. She's exactly what the company needs. Actual pharmaceutical experience and commitment to the original mission. I knew Patricia slightly from industry conferences. Brilliant researcher, strong ethical compass, completely uninterested in the kind of political games that had consumed Robert and Victoria. Her appointment sent a clear message about the direction Morrison Pharmaceuticals was taking. Back to the mission. Back to rare disease research. Back to everything Dr. Morrison had founded the company to do. I should have felt vindicated. Should have felt satisfaction that the company was being rescued from Robert's disastrous leadership. Instead, I mostly felt sad. Sad for Dr. Morrison watching his son's public disgrace. Sad for the employees who'd believed in Robert's vision. Sad for the time and energy wasted on cosmetics pivots and political infighting instead of work that actually mattered. But I also felt something else. Gratitude maybe that I'd gotten out when I did. That I was building something in London rather than still fighting battles in New York. That I'd chosen myself over loyalty to a man who'd stopped deserving it. Elena knocked on my office door that afternoon. Linda? The Cambridge team wants to schedule a call about advancing the cystic fibrosis compound to phase 2 trials. Are you available tomorrow morning? Absolutely, I said, pulling up my calendar. What time works for them? Real work. Scientific progress. Children's lives being saved. This was what mattered. Not corporate drama or executive downfalls or investigations into expense accounts. Robert's choices had consequences. Victoria's calculation had paid off in the short term but would probably haunt her long term. Dr. Morrison's company was being rescued by someone who actually understood its mission. Me. I was exactly where I needed to be, building something real while New York sorted through the wreckage of everything Robert had destroyed. The investigation concluded. Robert resigned. Victoria left quietly with her severance package and carefully crafted narrative. And Morrison Pharmaceuticals began the slow work of rebuilding its reputation under Patricia Hammond's leadership. I stayed in London watching it all from across the Atlantic, grateful for the distance, grateful for the escape, grateful that OK had meant exactly what I'd needed it to mean. Life in London had settled into a rhythm by the second year. The European division had grown from 8 people to 63, with offices now in London, Paris, and Berlin. We had 7 compounds in various stages of clinical trials, partnerships with 12 research institutions across Europe, and a reputation for being the part of Morrison Pharmaceuticals that had stayed true to the original mission. I'd made friends, actual friends, not just professional contacts. Emma, a researcher at Imperial College who I'd met through Marcus. David, a patent attorney who lived in my building and had talked me through the complicated process of international intellectual property law over numerous pub dinners. Sarah, an American expat who ran a bookshop in Bloomsbury and reminded me that life existed beyond pharmaceutical research. I'd built a life, in other words. Not the life I'd imagined when I was 26 and getting married, but a good life. An authentic one. So when the email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years and 3 months after I'd walked out of that Christmas party, I almost deleted it without reading. The sender address was one I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple, something I need to say. Spam probably. Or a phishing attempt. I hovered my cursor over the delete button. But something made me open it instead. The first line told me everything. Linda, I've been in therapy for 6 months. Robert. I should have stopped reading right there. Should have deleted it and maintained the walls I'd carefully built that had made peace possible. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and after 2 years of silence, part of me needed to know what he possibly thought he had to say now. My therapist suggested I write this. The email continued, not because you owe me anything but because I owe you the truth. I destroyed our marriage because I was terrified of my own inadequacy. I sat back in my chair staring at those words on my screen. You were brilliant. Everyone knew it. You understood the science in ways I never could. My father respected your judgment over mine. The researchers trusted you more than they trusted me. Instead of dealing with that insecurity, I tried to diminish you. I found someone who made me feel superior instead of inadequate. I used my position to punish you for being competent. I convinced myself you were the problem when the truth was I'd become someone I didn't recognize. Rain was streaking the windows of my Shoreditch office. That persistent London drizzle that never quite qualified as rain but soaked you thoroughly anyway. I read that paragraph 3 times, feeling complicated things. Robert was finally saying what I'd known for years. Finally admitting what had been obvious to everyone except him. But acknowledgement 2 years late couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the humiliation or the pain or the years of my life I'd spent trying to save something that had already died. The email went on. Victoria left me 6 months ago, by the way. Once I lost the CEO position, I stopped being useful to her. She's at a biotech startup now, still climbing, still ambitious, still everything she always was. I almost laughed at that. Of course Victoria had left once Robert lost his utility. Of course she'd landed somewhere else, probably with a carefully crafted narrative about having been caught up in circumstances beyond her control. That was who she'd always been. Someone who'd climb over anyone to get where she was going, then rewrite history to make herself look principled in the process. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Robert wrote. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that what you did, walking away, choosing yourself, building something meaningful in London, taught me more about leadership and integrity than I learned in my entire time as CEO. You were right. About the cosmetics pivot, about Victoria, about the cost of compromising our mission for profit. About everything. I hope London is everything you needed it to be. I hope you found peace." Robert. I stared at that closing for a long time. Hope you found peace. As if peace was something you found rather than something you built, day by day, decision by decision, through the hard work of choosing yourself even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. But yeah, I had found peace. Or built it. Whichever. I spent an hour debating whether to respond at all. Part of me wanted to just delete the email and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part, the part that had loved Robert once, that had believed in what we were building together, felt like he deserved some acknowledgement. Finally, I wrote back, "Robert, thank you for your honesty. I hope your therapy continues to help. I hope you find your way back to the person you were before ambition consumed everything else. Take care." Brief. True. Not warm but not cruel. Acknowledging his message without reopening doors that needed to stay closed. I hit send and closed my laptop, stood at my window watching London traffic below, thinking about how far I'd come from that Christmas Eve when my world had shattered. Robert's apology didn't change the past. It didn't make the betrayal hurt less or the humiliation fade. But it did offer something valuable. Confirmation that walking away had been exactly right, that the problem hadn't been me, that I'd made the only choice possible when staying would have meant slowly losing myself. 6 months later, on a cold September morning, I got a call from Patricia Hammond. "Linda." Her voice was gentle in a way that immediately made my stomach drop. "I have difficult news. James passed away last night. Peacefully in his sleep. His family was with him." I sat down heavily, my office suddenly feeling too small, the air too thin. Dr. Morrison. The man who'd seen me as more than just Robert's wife. Who'd valued my judgment. Who'd given me the escape route that had saved my life. Gone. "The memorial service is Saturday," Patricia continued. "In Manhattan. I know it's short notice, but the family specifically asked that you be notified. They said James would have wanted you there." I flew to New York that Friday, my first time back since I'd left 2 years and 9 months earlier. The city looked the same but felt different. Smaller, somehow less overwhelming, as if distance had shrunk it in my memory. The memorial service was at a Presbyterian church in Midtown, packed with hundreds of people whose lives Dr. Morrison had touched. Pharmaceutical industry leaders. Researchers whose work he'd funded. Patients. Actual patients, children who were alive because of treatments Morrison Pharmaceuticals had developed under his leadership. Patricia gave a eulogy that captured him perfectly. James Morrison built a company on the principle that every life has value, that diseases affecting thousands matter just as much as diseases affecting millions. In an industry often criticized for prioritizing shareholders over patients, he was a beacon of what healthcare capitalism could be at its best. I sat in the third row, crying quietly, mourning not just Dr. Morrison but everything he'd represented. The belief that you could be successful without being ruthless, that ethics and profit weren't mutually exclusive, that doing good and doing well didn't have to be opposing forces. Robert sat in the front row with his mother, looking older than his 42 years. Smaller somehow. Diminished in ways that went beyond physical appearance. Our eyes met once during the service. He nodded slightly. I nodded back. No words. No reconciliation. Just acknowledgement that we'd both loved the man being remembered and mourned, even if we'd betrayed that love in different ways. After the service, Dr. Morrison's lawyer, a man named Harold Chin who'd worked with the family for 30 years, pulled me aside. "Dr. Morrison left something for you," he said, handing me an envelope. "He asked that you read it privately." Back at my hotel that evening, I opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a letter in Dr. Morrison's familiar handwriting, dated 3 weeks before his death. Linda, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But before I go, I want you to know something. You saved my company. Not just the European division but the whole organization. By staying true to the mission, by refusing to compromise your ethics, by choosing to build something real instead of destroying Robert out of revenge, you reminded everyone what Morrison Pharmaceuticals was supposed to be. I had to stop reading, overwhelmed by emotion, grief and gratitude and the weight of being seen so clearly by someone who'd mattered so much. Robert was my son and I loved him. But you were the child of my vision, the one who understood what I was trying to build. Thank you for carrying that forward. Thank you for choosing integrity over revenge. The letter continued, and as I read the next paragraph, my breath caught. The company is yours now if you want it. The board is prepared to offer you the CEO position. I've left 40% of my voting shares to you, contingent on your acceptance. I stared at those words, reading them 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Dr. Morrison had left me control of Morrison Pharmaceuticals. Not just a position but actual voting shares. Enough to have real power, real authority to shape the company's direction. But if London has become your home, the letter concluded, if you'd rather keep building there than return to New York, I understand. Do what brings you peace. You've earned that. With love and gratitude, James. I sat with that letter for hours, watching Manhattan lights come on as evening fell, thinking about choices and consequences and what it means to honor someone's legacy. Dr. Morrison had offered me everything. Control of the company. Vindication over Robert. The chance to return to New York as the victor in a war I'd never wanted to fight. The temptation was real. Part of me wanted to accept, wanted to prove I could lead the whole company, wanted the satisfaction of sitting in the CEO chair while Robert watched from wherever his life had taken him. But that would have been about ego. About revenge. About proving something to people whose opinions no longer mattered. And I'd learned something crucial in my 2 years in London. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so good that their failure becomes irrelevant by comparison. I'd built that in London. I was still building it. The question was whether I wanted to give that up to return to New York and all the complicated history waiting there. I looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at the city that had once been my home, and I knew my answer. I flew back to London the next morning, Dr. Morrison's letter folded carefully in my bag, his words still echoing in my mind. The company is yours if you want it. 40% voting shares. The CEO position waiting for me. Everything I might have wanted 3 years ago, before the affair, before the ultimatum, before I'd learned that sometimes the thing you think you want most would actually destroy you. The call from Patricia Hammond came 2 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reviewing partnership agreements with the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm. Linda. Patricia's voice was warm but carried a professional uncertainty. I assume you've read James's letter by now. I have, I said carefully. Then you know the board is prepared to offer you the CEO position. I want to be clear. I was hired as interim leadership specifically because no one knew whether you'd accept the role James clearly intended for you. If you want to return to New York, I'll step aside. No hard feelings. This was always meant to be your company if you chose to claim it. I looked out my office window at the Thames, at the London skyline that had become so familiar over the past 2.5 years. Watched a tour boat drift past, tourists probably taking photos of Tower Bridge in the distance. Patricia, I appreciate the confidence, I said. Dr. Morrison's confidence, yours, the board's. It means more than you know. But, Patricia said, hearing what I hadn't said yet. But I'm going to decline. Silence on the other end. Then, can I ask why? Linda, this is everything most people in our industry spend entire careers working toward. Control of a major pharmaceutical company. The resources to shape research priorities. The platform to influence healthcare policy. Dr. Morrison built all of this and he wanted you to have it. Because I'm happy here, I said simply. I'm building something that matters. I have a team that functions on competence rather than politics. I make decisions based on science and ethics rather than stock prices and ego. I wake up every morning doing work that aligns with who I actually am. I paused, trying to find words for something I'd only recently fully understood myself. Accepting the CEO position would mean returning to New York. Navigating all the politics that destroyed my marriage. Constantly managing Robert's shadow and everyone's memories of what happened. Every decision I made would be examined through the lens of our history. Every challenge to my authority would carry subtext about whether I was qualified or just the ex-wife who came back to claim revenge. We could manage that, Patricia said. We could set clear boundaries, establish your authority independently of. You can't promise that, I interrupted gently. Culture change takes years. Organizations have memories. And honestly, Patricia, I don't want to spend the next decade of my life fighting those battles. I did that for 8 years in my marriage. I'm done fighting for space that should have been freely given. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. You've really thought about this? I have, I confirmed. And here's what I think. You're doing excellent work. You understand the mission. You have the scientific credibility and the ethical compass. You're already refocusing Morrison Pharmaceuticals on rare disease research, repairing relationships with academic institutions, bringing back the researchers who left under Robert's leadership. I took a breath. You're exactly the leader Morrison Pharmaceuticals needs right now. Someone without baggage, without complicated history, without personal dynamics clouding every interaction. I recommend you for the permanent CEO position. Build on what Dr. Morrison started. And let me keep building the European division. We can accomplish more working together across the Atlantic than we could with me trying to navigate New York politics. You're sure? Patricia asked. This isn't fear talking? Because if you change your mind in 6 months. I'm sure, I said firmly. This isn't fear. It's clarity. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire adult life, I know exactly what I want and why. That's worth more than any title. We talked logistics after that. How the equity stake would work with me staying in London, how we'd coordinate between US and European operations, how we'd structure reporting relationships to honor Dr. Morrison's vision while building something sustainable. When I finally hung up, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even fully realized I'd been carrying. The weight of expectation, of obligation, of feeling like I needed to prove something to people whose opinions had long since lost their power over me. I stayed in London. Over the next year, the European division grew to over 100 people with expanded offices in Paris and Berlin, and new partnerships across the continent. We became known as Morrison Pharmaceuticals Innovation Center, the place where ambitious rare disease research happened, where scientists came when they wanted to work on diseases that actually mattered rather than chasing blockbuster profits. The Karolinska Institute partnership yielded a promising compound for treating a rare form of muscular dystrophy. The Max Planck collaboration advanced research on genetic therapies for blood disorders. Cambridge and Oxford projects continued to progress through clinical trials. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A small research group at the University of Edinburgh that Marcus had connected us with. They'd been working on a treatment for a rare form of pediatric leukemia that affected fewer than 300 children annually in Europe. Most pharmaceutical companies wouldn't touch it. The market was too small. The research was too risky. The profit potential was essentially zero. But Dr. Morrison hadn't founded Morrison Pharmaceuticals to chase profits. He'd founded it to save lives that bigger companies deemed not worth saving. Our Edinburgh collaboration yielded a compound that showed remarkable results in phase 2 trials. The FDA granted it breakthrough therapy designation, fast-tracking approval. If it succeeded, when it succeeded, those 300 children would have a treatment option where none had existed before. That was vindication worth more than any CEO title. That was revenge in its purest form. Not destroying Robert but building something so meaningful that his failures became irrelevant by comparison. I thought about him sometimes. Wondered what he was doing, whether therapy had actually helped, whether he'd found any peace in whatever life he'd built after losing everything. Through industry contacts I heard fragments. He'd taken a consulting position at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company. Strategy work. Fine but unremarkable. The kind of career that paid well but left no particular mark on the world. Victoria had landed at a biotech startup, apparently having learned just enough from her Morrison Pharmaceuticals disasters to be moderately competent in a less prominent role. She'd probably climb again eventually. People like Victoria always did. But she'd never reach the heights she'd aimed for, would always carry the reputation of someone who'd slept her way to a position she couldn't actually perform. Neither of them was thriving. But neither had been completely destroyed either. They were just ordinary. Average. People who'd reached higher than their competence justified, failed spectacularly, and settled into comfortable mediocrity. Me. I was extraordinary, Not because of titles or recognition, but because I was doing work that mattered while living a life that felt authentic. I'd found peace in London. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the presence of purpose and meaning and the daily satisfaction of building something real. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about that Christmas Eve 3 years ago. About standing in Robert's office while he demanded I apologize to his mistress. About saying that one word, okay, and watching his face shift from triumph to confusion to eventual horror as he realized what okay actually meant. Okay hadn't meant agreement or surrender. It had meant, okay, I see who you've become. Okay, I'm done trying to save something that's already dead. Okay, I choose myself. Okay, watch what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. Those 2 syllables had carried me across an ocean, through years of rebuilding, through the collapse of everything I'd thought defined me. Marriage, position, identity constructed around someone else's success. They carried me into something better. Something real. Something entirely mine. I'd learned that revenge doesn't have to be destruction. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Building something meaningful, finding peace, constructing a life on your own terms rather than someone else's expectations. I'd learned that walking away isn't weakness. It's often the bravest choice you can make when staying would mean slowly losing yourself. I'd learned that the relationships worth keeping are built on mutual respect rather than need or obligation or complicated power dynamics where love and control become impossible to separate. And I'd learned that okay is sometimes the most powerful word in any language. Not because it agrees but because it acknowledges reality and chooses differently. Sitting in my London office on a rainy Tuesday evening, reviewing research proposals that would save children's lives, surrounded by a team that valued competence over politics, living in a city that had become home in ways New York never was, I finally meant it completely. I was okay. And that wasn't just enough. That was everything. The European division continued to grow. The Edinburgh compound advanced toward approval. New partnerships formed with research institutions I'd only dreamed of working with. Robert's shadow faded until it was barely visible, just a lesson learned rather than a wound still bleeding. Victoria became irrelevant, someone I occasionally heard about through industry gossip but who no longer occupied space in my thoughts. Dr. Morrison's legacy lived on, not in New York headquarters but in London labs in children's hospitals across Europe, in research that saved lives because it was the right thing to do, not because it was profitable. And I lived, fully, authentically on my own terms. Sometimes people asked if I regretted not taking the CEO position. If I wondered what might have been different if I'd returned to New York to claim the company Dr. Morrison had wanted me to have. The answer was always no. Because I'd learned the most important lesson of all. Winning isn't about claiming the biggest prize or proving you were right or making people who hurt you pay for what they did. Winning is choosing yourself. Building something meaningful. Finding peace. And by that measure I'd won completely. Okay, I'd said 3 years ago. And okay, I meant now. Not as surrender. Not as acceptance of defeat. But as the most powerful declaration I'd ever made. I am okay. I chose myself. And that choice saved my life. If this story of quiet power and strategic revenge had you gripping your seat, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Linda said, okay, at the Christmas party and walked out with her head high, leaving Robert panicking. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful revenge stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.